Today on the Marsh line, we're going to be demonstrating on how we created this highly detailed track work. I'm going to give you a step-by-step instruction so that way you have the tips and tools to do it yourself at home. Hi, I'm Andy Dorsch and welcome back to the Chicago Northwestern Marsh Line layout. As you can see behind me, we've got a little progress on this module here in Eldorado. And as you can see, we've really been focusing on that track work. So I know you're not going to see a big C628 rolling down the marsh line, but I did want to show you guys the progress I've made on the marsh line and the way I laid this super detailed track. So, like with any good prototypical model, I actually took a look at some pictures of Eldorado to get an idea of what the track actually looked like in this area on the marsh line. It was pretty dilapidated, as you can see from the pictures, and I wanted to try and recreate that effect as closely as I could on my module. So we notice the weeds within the ties here. We can also see that the track is kind of wobbly and the ties are in quite a state of disrepair. So I wanted to go ahead and recreate all of that on this module so that you could get the impression that you were standing trackside, so you can almost smell the fading creosote. So to get things started, we're going to transpose the track plan onto the module. So I'm just starting here with a microengineering turnout just to kind of get an idea as to where the track's going to lay out. And I'll actually come back in, and when I lay the track, I'll use a homemade fast tracks one that I put together. So I'm just marking the diverging route, the throw bars, and then I'll go back and mark the frogs as well, just so I know where this turnout's going to lay. Once I have that diverging route in place, I'm going to put an arc in here, and I'm going to use a little trick I picked up where I just take a piece of cork roadbed, tack it in one spot, and then trace the arc to my connecting straight track there, so I have a nice smooth transition from my diverging route to the siding in Eldorado. And then the last bit here, I just use my 4-foot straight edge and carry out the arc from the siding and connect it to my other arc on the other side of the Eldorado siding. So with our track plan transposed to the module, it's time to lay some cork. So I'm just using some weld bond here, PVA type glue. Got it at Ace Hardware. It's relatively inexpensive. I lay out a bead, and then I just get my hands dirty here and spread it out nice and evenly, so that way the cork has a nice even surface to adhere to. So I'll just come in here, lay the first strip down, and make sure that it's perfectly on the line. I'll get out the 4-foot straight edge just to ensure that it is straight. So we'll go ahead and adjust the cork there, get it all straightened out. Looks pretty good. And we'll pull that away, and then we'll bring in the other side of the roadbed. We'll give it one final eyeball here and call it good. Once the glue is dried, I'll come back and sand the cork down. That way I have a nice smooth surface to glue my track down to. And then I'll also go ahead and sand the bevels of the cork roadbed because when I pull the two strips apart before I lay it, sometimes it leaves a nasty little edge on the bevel, so I want that nice and smooth. So here we're gonna take some good old Krylon camouflage brown and paint my ties. And you can see here these ties are resin casts out of some molds a friend made for me of some really beat up old ties. So while that paint's drying, we'll go ahead and solder the rails to some PC board ties. So as you can see here, I have a track gauge in place to ensure that my rails are lined up properly, and then I'll go ahead and solder those PC board ties periodically throughout these set of rails, just to ensure the gauge of my track here in Eldorado. These ties are gonna be fastened by super glue, so I don't want it to get all wonky and wobbly and cause any derailments. First and foremost is the railroad should run good. So I want to impart a little wisdom here when soldering up your track to your PC board ties. Flux is your friend, so I just gob it on, and I'll make sure that I melt it all away when I bring my soldering iron in. So as you can see, it's smoking away there. The flux really gives the solder the ability to flow and kind of cleans off any contaminants on the PC board tie, so I get a nice strong joint. And as you can see there, gobbed it a little too much, but heavy on the flux. And then I'm using a T-pin here to hold the track in place, because sometimes it had a little bit of wander to it. So I'll just use a T-pin to kind of hold things in place. And I have my rail gauges in place, and we'll go ahead and solder another set of rails to another tie here. So now we're going to go ahead and glue those cast resin ties to the rails. So I'm using Loctite super glue. As you can see, the brown spray paint turned out pretty good here. So we'll add a drop to the tie plate, and it's not going to cooperate here. It's going to stick to the glue bottle. So I'll bring in the tweezers here to kind of hold it down, and then I'll try and manipulate the tie here to glue it to the rails. So once I get it on here, not really worried about the spacing too much. I'm just kind of using the old Mark I eyeball. And I had a friend suggest that in terms of tie spacing for rails on the marsh line, that every 8th tie or so I kick one end about 15 degrees off center, because that's what the prototype was like. So as you can see here, these resin ties are beat up pretty bad. They're misshapen. They're not symmetrical by any stretch of the imagination, and they're just perfect for what I want on the marsh line. It may seem like this process took a long time, but as you can see here, I was working pretty fast. So this is the result. We get some really ugly looking, ratty looking railroad ties under some rail. Just what I'm looking for. With our ties firmly glued to the rails, it's time to glue down our homemade, I guess I'll call it homemade flex track. So I'm just using some Type-On wood glue here, and I use the yellow stuff because it's water resistant. So when I add scenery to it later, it won't come up or peel up with any alcohol or water that I add to it. And I'm using an old plumber's flux brush here to kind of get underneath the rails here and spread stuff out. So just come in here and run a bead down, and I'll come through and smooth it out. and get a nice even coat here on the road bed, only working about a foot at a time. And then we'll just slam the rails down here and glue it right tight. So once the track's been all glued down, we'll have to come back in and paint the rails. So as you can see here, I'm using some dark burnt umber. This is just your cheapy craft paint. This bottle cost me $1.69 and I got it from Ben Franklin. That's right, we still have Ben Franklin's here in Ripon. So I go ahead and just paint the rails up. Prior to this step, I went ahead and added some joint bars to add a little extra detail to the rails. So I get my joint bars from Precision Design Company, pdc.com, and Billy over there does some laser cutting, and he cut up a bunch of Code 70 joint bars for me that turned out fantastic, and they're just a nice little added detail to this track. So put those joint bars on before you paint, because if you try to glue them on after you paint, they tend not to stick so well. As you can see here, I'm just finishing up this little section with the burnt umber, or the dark burnt umber, just to kind of give that rusty appearance for the rails. Keeping our paintbrush out here, we're just going to add a wash, brown wash to the ties as well. So just kind of covering up anything the spray paint may have missed, and adding that nice dark wash to get down into the cracks. So when we come back with our lighter weathering later, they'll give that real nice shadow effect. As you can see here, we're just dipping it in the water and just kind of washing that craft paint right over the top. The next step here is to lay the marshline mud and the quote-unquote ballast to the track work here. So as you can see, I'm coming in with a little scoop here of, this is actually clay that I dug out of the backyard, which is pretty much the mud that we have around here. So I'm just going ahead and spreading that between the ties, and I'll take a paintbrush here and just kind of feather it out. So I don't want to bring the mud all the way up to the top of the ties here, because a lot of the ballast and mud and underlayment for the ties and track on the marshline was kind of washed away. So I don't want to overdo it. I'll just come through here and do the shoulders of the roadbed, kind of angling my brush down, and then I'll kind of zip all the excess off the top of the ties here. The one drawback with using this clay was that it's really fine and it kind of got into everything, so it kind of took away from the detail in the ties, because it would get down into the grooves and crevices in some areas. So here I've gone in and I've just laid a little bit of Pink Lady ballast, and I'm just smoothing that out over the top of the mud. So now we're setting the ballast in mud, just using some 91% alcohol here in a pipette, and I pretty much drenched this whole section of track in alcohol. This alcohol kind of helped clean the ties off a little bit to get that dusty residue from the clay out of there. And as you can see, made pretty quick work here with the pipette and the jug of alcohol, and I just gob it on everywhere. I really want to saturate the area track. So now that we've got the area pretty much soaked, we're going to use our scenic cement here. This is a homemade solution of Elmer's glue and water. It's a 50-50 mix, and the bottle I got from the dollar store at Dollar Tree. So it's quite handy to kind of have this in a squirt bottle because you can strategically apply scenic cement wherever you need it. With our mud and ballast now glued down and dry, I'm coming back in with some Pan Pastels here to just kind of lighten up the ties. So I'm just got an old crummy paintbrush here, and I'm using light gray, and I really want to get that sun-baked effect on these railroad ties. So these ties are in upwards of 70 years old. They're been beaten over the years by the sun, and they're starting to kind of whitewash and really starting to decompose. So go through here with some light gray to start, and I'll just take my blending brush and get rid of all the gobs of it. As you can see here, we got some nice lightened ties. Let's kind of move a little more here, and then what we'll do is we'll come back with some brown here, some iron oxide brown, and just kind of lightly tap in some highlights here just to kind of tone down the gray a little bit. So we'll repeat this process for the whole section of track here. So now it's time for my favorite part of this project. It's laying the ballast, the green ballast. So we're going to use some static grass here to lay in between our railroad ties and along the shoulders of the ballast here, just to kind of give that effect that the marsh line has got weeds growing up through the tracks. The brush and stuff is starting to encroach on the right-of-way here and really give the impression that it's a ratty branch line that doesn't see a lot of maintenance. So I've gone and applied some static tack, and we have a Woodland Scenic Static King static grass applicator here. So we're just going to go ahead with our homemade mixture of static grass, and we're going to go ahead and start shaking it out. So as you can see here, I got some strategically placed glue in between the ties of this turnout, and then you can see where I've gobbed on the static tack off to the right hand side there, where I really want the grass to cover the terrain underneath. So once the static tack has dried, we're going to go ahead and vacuum up the excess. As you can see here, the grass is sparsely populated in between the ties, and it is heavily congregated on the shoulders of the ballast. So as you can see here, leaving some nice detail. As you get in the siding, it's a little more overgrown. And then as you check out the main line at the top of the screen here, you can see just a little bit of grass leaking into the ties here and there. Really cool effect. I think this turned out really great. So now it's time to enjoy our work here. So let's run some trains. We're going to do a little bit of a run by here with an Elco C628. If you want to see more tutorial videos from me, go ahead and click on the video up in the upper right hand corner. Otherwise, make sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of my model railroading content. Thanks for watching.